When I bought my property on Maplewood Lane 3 years ago, I thought I had finally found the perfect blend of peace and practicality. A spacious main house for me, a cozy back house I had renovated into a comfortable rental unit for some extra income, and a big yard with enough trees that I could drink coffee in the morning without even seeing my neighbors if I didn't want to. The street was quiet, mostly retirees and families who kept to themselves, and although the neighborhood was under a homeowners association, I didn't give it much thought at the time. The rules seemed basic. Keep your lawn maintained, no loud parties after 10 p.m., no exterior paint in neon colors, and the HOA fee wasn't outrageous. For the first 2 years, I barely heard from them, aside from the occasional newsletter about community events or reminders about trash pickup schedules. That all changed when Margaret arrived. Margaret, though everyone quickly started calling her Karen with the clipboard, was the kind of woman who introduced herself like she was running for office, with a wide smile that never reached her eyes, and a voice that carried across the street even when she was just talking. Within weeks of moving in, she had managed to get herself elected HOA president in an uncontested vote after the previous president retired to Florida, and almost immediately, she started pushing for reforms. The first couple of changes were small enough. She banned inflatable holiday decorations over 5 feet tall and set a new policy for approved mailbox colors. But then, one Tuesday morning, she knocked on my door wearing her floral blouse, oversized sunglasses, and clutching a thick, freshly printed rulebook like it was a sacred text. "We've implemented a new bylaw," she said with that sugary tone that barely masked her authority. "No renting secondary structures to non-family members. It changes the character of the community." I told her very clearly that I had a signed lease with my tenant, Mark, and that the HOA didn't have jurisdiction over my rental arrangement. Her smile froze for half a second, just long enough for me to see the steel behind it. And then she leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "People who don't cooperate," she said, "tend to regret it." I laughed it off at the time, but over the next few weeks I realized she wasn't bluffing. It started with a notice in my mailbox for grass too long, when my lawn had been freshly mowed 2 days prior. Then came the letter about my improper trash can placement. Apparently it was 3 inches too close to the curb. Mark began receiving vague complaints about noise, even though he worked nights and wasn't home during the day. Then came the anonymous note slipped under my door that simply read, "Sell or suffer." I knew it was her, but without proof, all I could do was document everything. Mark suggested maybe we should just play nice until his lease was up, but I wasn't about to let a petty HOA president bully me off my own property. That's when the strange occurrences began. Our backyard gate, which I always kept latched, started being found wide open in the morning. My security lights, which were motion-activated, were turned off at the breaker box one night. Then, one Saturday around midnight, I woke to the faint sound of footsteps outside. I checked the backyard from my upstairs window but saw nothing. I was beginning to think I was getting paranoid, but my gut told me this was deliberate. One evening, I ran into Margaret at the community mailbox. She smiled too wide and said, "Hope you're enjoying your little guest house while it lasts." I responded, "I will, and so will Mark, until his lease runs out." She didn't reply, just kept smiling that smug, self-satisfied smile. A week later, the harassment escalated. This time, she filed a formal complaint to the county about an illegal rental dwelling on my property. It went nowhere because the back house was fully permitted, but I had to waste an entire afternoon proving it to a county inspector. That same night, my doorbell camera caught someone walking by with a hood up, pausing at my driveway for just long enough to shine a flashlight at the side of my house before continuing on. The figure was too far away to identify, but the timing felt intentional. I began keeping a log of every incident. Then came the night that changed everything. It was just after midnight when I woke up to the smell of smoke. At first, I thought, Maybe Mark had burned something cooking a late-night snack, but then I heard the popping sound of wood catching, and when I looked out the back window, my heart sank. Flames were pouring out of the back house's side windows, reaching high into the night sky. I ran outside barefoot, yelling for Mark, who appeared at the back door, coughing, his clothes streaked with soot. "Get out! Get out now!" I screamed as I pulled him away from the building, the heat so intense it felt like the skin on my face was burning. By the time the fire department arrived, the back house was almost entirely consumed. The fire chief pulled me aside after they got the flames under control and told me they'd found clear signs of accelerant. This wasn't an accident. My blood ran cold. I had just installed new security cameras 2 weeks earlier, and when I pulled up the footage, my stomach flipped. A shadowy figure in a wide-brimmed hat was moving around the back house with a gas can. The angle wasn't great, but I knew that stiff, deliberate walk. I knew it was her. And that was the moment I decided this wasn't just going to be about rebuilding. This was going to be about making her pay. And trust me, if you want to hear exactly how I took down the most arrogant HOA president this neighborhood has ever seen and walked away with $1, $2 million in court, make sure you subscribe, because this story is only getting started. The morning after the fire, the air still smelled of wet ash and charred wood, and the backyard looked like something out of a nightmare. Blackened beams jutting out of the rubble like broken bones, puddles of murky water left behind by the fire hoses, and what used to be Mark's living room reduced to a soggy pile of ash and melted furniture. Mark was at the hospital for smoke inhalation, and I stood there staring at the wreckage, alternating between disbelief and rage. The fire. Marshall arrived again later that day, clipboard in hand, and went over the findings. There was no doubt in his mind it was arson. An accelerant had been poured along the exterior wall, and the pattern of the flame suggested it was lit intentionally. That confirmed what I already knew, but knowing and proving are two very different things. I handed over the footage from my security cameras, and while the grainy night vision clearly showed a person in a wide-brimmed hat carrying a gas can, the resolution wasn't sharp enough to make out her face. "It's circumstantial," the detective told me when he came by. "You've got a hunch, but juries don't convict on hunches." That's when I decided I was going to turn my property into a fortress of evidence gathering. I upgraded all my cameras to 4K with floodlights, installed hidden trail cams along the fence line, and even put in an audio recorder near the mailbox. I started logging every single interaction with Margaret, date, time, what she said, and who was there. But Margaret wasn't hiding. In fact, she doubled down. 2 days after the fire, she called an emergency HOA meeting to discuss safety concerns regarding rental properties. I attended, not to defend myself. There was nothing to defend, but to watch her spin her narrative. She stood at the front of the community center, dressed in a sharp blazer, acting like a martyr for the neighborhood. "We all saw the smoke," she said to the gathered residents. "And while it's a tragedy, it's also a wake-up call about what kind of people these rentals attract." A few neighbors glanced at me with uncertainty, clearly influenced by her poison. I stood up and calmly stated that the fire was arson, that the investigation was ongoing, and that my tenant was a working professional who had never caused a problem. Margaret smirked and replied, "Investigations take time. Meanwhile, the safety of our community is my top priority." She made it sound like she was some kind of savior cleaning up my mess. That was the moment I realized she wasn't just trying to get me to comply. She was trying to destroy my reputation so that if this ever went public, people would already see me as the villain. Over the next week, I noticed she was always around, passing, by my driveway, lingering near my property line, stopping to talk to neighbors in low voices when she saw me outside. One evening, I caught her on my new cameras, standing at the edge of my yard, pointing toward my burned-out guest house while speaking to 2 men I didn't recognize. That footage went straight to my private investigator, a retired police detective I'd hired to help build the case. He began digging into Margaret's background, and what he found was telling. 2 years before moving here, She'd been involved in a bitter HOA dispute in another state that ended with her being voted out. After accusations of harassment, there had even been a small claims case filed against her for property damage, but it was settled quietly. The investigator also managed to track down the hardware store where the exact same brand of gas can from my footage had been sold 3 days before the fire. And guess whose credit card was on the receipt? Margaret's. The cherry on top? The store's security cameras were crystal clear, showing her walking out with the gas can and a pack of matches. I handed everything over to the police, but Margaret still acted like she was untouchable. She even had the audacity to send me a final warning letter from the HOA demanding I cease all illegal rental activity or face fines of $500 a day. At this point, it wasn't about the back house anymore. It was about my name, my property rights, and making sure she paid for every bit of damage she'd caused. The county fire investigator formally concluded the fire was arson, and with the hardware store footage, the receipt, and my recordings, the police finally moved in. Margaret was brought in for questioning, and though she denied everything, the cracks in her composure were obvious. My investigator had also pulled my doorbell camera audio from a month earlier, the one I hadn't thought much about, where, as she turned to walk away from my porch, she muttered under her breath, "That'll teach you to say no to me." That single line became the linchpin tying her threats to the crime. Once the case was handed over to the district attorney, I knew we were heading for a trial, and I started working with my attorney on a civil lawsuit for damages, loss of rental income, cost of rebuilding, and emotional distress. Meanwhile, Margaret tried one last trick. She went door to door with flyers claiming I was suing the HOA to bankrupt it and bringing in dangerous outsiders. It backfired spectacularly when one of my neighbors, tired of her antics, handed me one of the flyers along with his own sworn statement about seeing Margaret walking toward my property the night of the fire. Piece by piece, the wall around her was collapsing. By the time the court date was set, I had a file so thick with evidence that my lawyer said it was the easiest case of his career. Margaret, however, still acted confident, strutting into the pre-trial hearings like she was going to charm the judge into dismissing everything. But she didn't know that the moment we stepped into that courtroom, her whole world was about to come crashing down.